Picture the deserts of Jordan from above. From 30,000 feet, you see a landscape of ochre and bone, a vast, sun-baked emptiness, carved by wind and time. It looks like it has for millennia. A sterile canvas, beautiful in its desolation. Except that's not what you're actually seeing. Look closer. The patterns begin to emerge, faint lines drawn across hundreds of miles of rock and sand. Giant, perfect circles, intricate spoked wheels, V-shaped funnels kilometers long. These are not natural formations. They are structures, so enormous they are completely invisible from the ground. They are a ghost architecture, a city of titans hiding in plain sight. This isn't just an archaeological curiosity. This is evidence of a lost chapter of the human story, written on a scale we thought was impossible. And if you're using this video to relax, perfect. That's exactly what it's for. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love checking those. It's wild seeing London at sunrise, New York at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching at the same time. Our journey tonight takes us into this impossible landscape. We're going to become aerial archaeologists, soaring over the black desert of Jordan and Saudi Arabia, to witness something that completely dismantles the tidy timeline of human civilization. First, we will uncover the mystery of the structures known as the works of the old men, these thousands upon thousands of stone megastructures. We will examine the most prominent of them, the terrifyingly vast hunting traps called kites, the enigmatic and perfect big circles, and the strange, star-like wheels. Then we will confront the most unsettling question of all, their age, because these structures don't just predate the pyramids, they predate the very invention of the city, of agriculture, of writing itself. Finally, we will be left staring into the void, asking who could have built them. What forgotten society possessed the knowledge, the organisation, and the sheer manpower to engineer the very face of the planet before history was ever written down? Let's begin with the kites. Imagine you're one of the first pilots flying over this region in the early 20th century. Below you, the world is a map of brown and yellow. But then you see them. Two impossibly long lines, low stone walls, stretching for miles. They start wide apart and slowly, inexorably, converge, like a giant V-shaped funnel laid across the earth. At the point where they almost meet, you see a cluster of small, circular pits, some dug deep into the ground. These are the kites. The name was given by those first pilots because their shape resembled the simple stringed kites of their childhood. But there is nothing simple about them. Some of these guiding walls run in perfectly straight lines for over a kilometre. Others are gently curved, subtly guiding their prey over the curve of the earth. The level of precision is staggering. From the ground, you would have no idea what you were building. Stand next to one of the walls, and it's just a low pile of rocks, maybe a metre high. You can see over it easily. 100 feet away, it's a meaningless feature in a vast, featureless landscape. You would need a perspective that no human on the ground could possess. You would need to see the world from the sky, and yet they were built with an unnerving accuracy, all converging on what archaeologists call the killing pit. The accepted theory, and it is a compelling one, is that these were gargantuan traps for hunting wild animals, primarily gazelle. Herds would be panicked and driven between the two long arms of the kite. As the walls closed in, the animals would be funneled into a state of absolute terror and confusion, unable to turn back, forced ever forward until they tumbled into the deep pits at the end, where they could be easily slaughtered. On the surface, this makes sense. It's a clever, if brutal, method of securing a massive amount of food. But the moment you stop and think about the implications, the entire theory begins to unravel into a series of profound and disturbing questions. Consider the sheer scale of labour involved. We are not talking about a small group of hunters building a temporary blind. We are talking about quarrying, moving, and placing millions of stones to build a single structure that is several miles long. How many people would that take? How many man-hours, how many generations would be invested in a single kite? The logistics are mind-blowing. You would need planners, architects, surveyors, and a massive, coordinated workforce. And for what? A single hunt? Even if it yielded 100 gazelle, the caloric expenditure to build a trap would seem to far outweigh the reward. But here is where the mystery deepens into something truly unsettling. There isn't just one kite, or a dozen, or even 100. Archaeologists, using satellite imagery from Google Earth and academic surveys, have now identified over 6,000 of them. 6,000. They litter the landscape of Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and even into Kazakhstan. This was not a local phenomenon. This was a continental-scale strategy of landscape engineering. This was an industrial operation, an industry of harvesting wild animals carried out by a people we have been taught were simple nomadic hunter-gatherers. Think about what that number implies. It implies a population density far greater than we have ever imagined for this period. It implies a level of social organisation that is supposed to be the hallmark of later agricultural civilizations. Hunter-gatherers, as we understand them, move with the herds. They are mobile, living in small egalitarian bands. They do not typically engage in monumental, permanent construction projects that would tie them to a single location for generations. Yet here is the evidence, written in stone, for a coordinated, systematic, and widespread effort that required exactly that. Who were these people? They were building on a scale that would rival the road builders of the Roman Empire, yet they were doing it thousands of years before Rome was even a myth. And why so many? Some kites are built right next to each other. Some even overlap, with newer ones cutting across the arms of older ones. This suggests they were used over an immense period of time. It also suggests a level of consumption of wild game that is hard to fathom. Were they simply feeding themselves, or were they producing a surplus? A surplus of meat, hides and sinew that could be traded? If so, with whom? What other civilizations existed at this time that could be their trading partners? The timeline simply doesn't allow for it. It feels like finding a microchip in a medieval castle. The object is there, the evidence is undeniable, but the context for its existence is completely missing. The kites challenge the very definition of what it means to be a hunter-gatherer. They blur the line between a society that lives off the land and a society that actively reshapes the land to suit its needs. This is not passive hunting. This is active, aggressive, large-scale resource management. It required a level of abstract thought, long-term planning, and communal effort that we have traditionally reserved for the farmers and city dwellers who came thousands of years later. The people who built the kites may not have planted seeds, but they were harvesting the landscape with a terrifying and systematic efficiency. They were not just surviving in the desert, they were engineering it. But the kites, as baffling as they are only the beginning of the story, because scattered amongst them, and often predating them, are even stranger, more abstract structures. Imagine again, you are in the air, you pass over one of the V-shaped kites, and then, a few miles away, you see something else, a perfect circle. Not a small stone circle for a campfire or a hut, a big circle, a low wall of unworked stones, meticulously laid out to form a near-perfect geometric shape, 400 metres in diameter. That's a quarter of a mile across, the length of 4 football fields laid end to end. These circles are stunning in their precision and their stark simplicity. Unlike the kites, they have no obvious utilitarian purpose. They are not traps, they are not fortifications, as the walls are typically only a few feet high. Many of them have no entrances or exits. They are simply enormous, enclosed spaces, built for a reason that is entirely lost to us. They are pure geometry imposed upon the chaos of the natural world. Building something this large and this perfectly circular without an aerial viewpoint is a staggering feat of primitive engineering and surveying. It would require a central anchor point and a rope or cord hundreds of meters long to act as a compass, and a team of workers painstakingly laying out the stones. Why? What was the purpose of creating these immense, empty enclosures? Were they ritual spaces? Were they arenas for social gatherings? Were they some form of astronomical calendar, meant to align with celestial events, even though no obvious alignments have been found? The lack of artifacts inside them only deepens the mystery. They are strangely clean, as if their purpose required them to be kept empty. They feel less like a place for doing something, and more like a symbol in themselves, a statement, a marker on the landscape that declared ownership, or perhaps a connection to a cosmology we can no longer comprehend. The sheer effort involved is, once again, the sticking point. Why would a society, supposedly living on the edge of survival, dedicate such immense resources to building something with no clear practical function? It speaks to a level of social complexity and symbolic thought that is, again, completely out of place for the era. Monumental architecture is supposed to follow a food surplus, which comes from agriculture. It is a luxury of a settled society. Yet here it is, on a massive scale, in a pre-agricultural context. It's as if the social and ideological software developed long before the agricultural hardware was in place. And then there are the wheels, perhaps the most visually striking and enigmatic of all these structures. From the air, they look like giant wagon wheels laid flat on the desert floor. A central cairn or hub with a series of stone spokes radiating outwards to a concentric circle. Some have a few spokes like a simple cross. Others have dozens, creating an intricate web-like pattern. They vary in size from a few dozen meters to over 100 meters in diameter. And just like the circles, their purpose is a complete mystery. Some archaeologists have suggested they are funerary. The central hub is often a cairn that may have once contained a burial. The spokes, then, could be symbolic, perhaps representing lines of kinship or pathways to the afterlife. It's a plausible theory, but it doesn't explain the sheer variety and complexity of the designs. Nor does it explain why some wheels have no central burial cairn at all. Others have suggested an astronomical function. Perhaps the spokes align with the rising and setting of certain stars, or the sun at the solstices. Indeed, some studies have shown that some spokes seem to align with the sunrise during the winter solstice. But this explanation also feels incomplete. Not all wheels show these alignments, and the number of spokes often seems far more than would be necessary for a simple solar calendar. What if their purpose was something else entirely? What if they were maps, not of the land but of the sky, or perhaps of a social structure? What if each spoke represented a family or a clan, all connected to a central point of origin or leadership? We are deep in the realm of speculation here, because the builders left us no user manual. They left only the hardware, these silent stone patterns that stare up at the sky. their meaning lost like a forgotten language. The wheels, the circles, and the kites are not isolated phenomena. They exist together, sometimes in dense clusters, creating a truly ancient engineered landscape. Satellite surveys in Jordan's Harat al-Shafa volcanic field, for example, have revealed a density of these structures that is almost unbelievable. Hundreds of kites, circles, and wheels are packed together, sometimes overlapping, telling a story of continuous construction and use over thousands of years. It's a prehistoric urban sprawl, but without the houses. It's a landscape of pure function and pure symbol, a testament to a society that was obsessed with shaping the very ground beneath its feet. This brings us to the core of the mystery, the single fact that elevates these structures from a regional curiosity to a world historical enigma. Their age. For decades, archaeologists could only guess. The structures were notoriously difficult to date. They are made of stone, which cannot be carbon dated, and they are often swept clean of organic artifacts. But with the advent of new technologies, specifically optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, we can now date the sediment and soil beneath the stones. OSL can tell us the last time that soil was exposed to sunlight. In other words, it can tell us when the stones were laid down on top of it. The results that have come back from these tests are nothing short of paradigm-shattering. Some of the kites have been dated to at least 7,000 years old. Others appear to be older, perhaps 8,000 years old. But some of the circular and linear structures, the geoglyphs that underpin the more complex kites, have returned dates of 9,000, even 10,000 years old. Let's pause and absorb what that means. 10,000 years old is 8,000 BC. This is 5,500 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. It is 6,000 years before Stonehenge. This is an era we call the pre-pottery Neolithic, a time when humanity was supposedly just beginning to experiment with agriculture, living in the first small primitive settlements. According to the standard model of history, the people alive in 8,000 BC were not supposed to be capable of this. They were not supposed to have the social organisation, the specialised labour, the abstract planning, or the sheer numbers to undertake construction on a continental scale. Monumental architecture is the result of civilization, but these monuments appear long before any recognised civilization existed in the area. It's a complete inversion of the historical timeline. It suggests that the capacity for massive, coordinated engineering projects is not a late-stage development of humanity, but something we have been capable of for far, far longer than we ever knew. So who were they? Who were these ghost architects of the ancient desert? The simple answer is we don't know. We have no name for them. They left no writing, because writing hadn't been invented yet. They left very little pottery, because in the earliest period of construction, pottery hadn't been invented yet either. The few settlements that have been found from this period seem far too small to account for the labour force needed for these projects. It's as if the workforce commuted from somewhere else, built these mind-bending structures, and then vanished. We can, however, make some educated guesses about their world. 10,000 years ago, the Black Desert of Jordan was not the hyper-arid landscape it is today. It was a greener, more temperate savanna. It was a rich ecosystem, teeming with the herds of gazelle, onagers, and other animals that the kites were built to hunt. These ancient people lived in a land of relative plenty. This environmental context makes the scale of their hunting operations even more baffling. They weren't desperately scratching out a living in a barren wasteland. They were living in a garden, and yet they developed this industrial-scale system of harvesting life. Why the intensity? Why the extreme landscape-altering effort when life was seemingly good. Perhaps the kites were not just about food, perhaps they were also about power. The ability to organise their construction, to control the hunts, and to distribute the massive surplus of meat would have created a powerful social hierarchy. The kites may have been engines of social change, allowing a new class of leaders or priests to emerge, their authority demonstrated by their ability to command both the labour of their people and the fate of the animal herds. The structures themselves became a source of political and social capital. This idea is radical. It suggests that complex social structures and hierarchies could develop before the advent of agriculture, not as a result of it. The traditional story is that farming creates a surplus, which allows for specialised labour, which leads to social stratification and monumental works. These structures in Jordan flip that script. Here, the monumental works, based on highly organised hunting, seem to be the driving force of social complexity. They were a different path to civilization, one that was ultimately a dead end, or perhaps one that was simply forgotten when the climate changed and the rains stopped. As the region slowly dried out over the millennia, the savanna turned to desert, and the great herds vanished. The society that depended on them would have been forced to change, to adapt, or to move away. Their great stone engines of the hunt would fall silent. Their circles and wheels, their meanings perhaps already fading, would be left to the wind and the sun. The collective memory of who they were and what they had achieved would be scoured from the earth, leaving only the stones themselves. An anonymous, impossible legacy. What we are looking at here is the footprint of a lost civilization. Not a civilization in the traditional sense of cities and kings and writing, but something else, a civilization of hunters, a culture that achieved a level of sophistication, organization, and landscape engineering that we are only now, from the vantage point of space, beginning to recognize and appreciate. They demonstrate that the path to complexity is not a single, linear road that every society must walk. There were other routes, other experiments in living, other forms of human genius. This discovery is not an isolated one. It connects to a growing body of evidence from around the world that is forcing us to completely re-evaluate the capabilities of our deep ancestors. Think of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Discovered in the 1990s, it is a vast temple complex of massive carved T-shaped pillars, dated to at least 9,500 BC, even older than many of the Jordanian structures. It too was built by people who were supposedly pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. It too demonstrates a staggering level of artistic and engineering skill and social organisation that should not have existed at that time. What if the Jordanian kites and Göbekli Tepe are pieces of the same puzzle? They are geographically close and their timelines overlap. They both represent a sudden, inexplicable explosion of monumental construction in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Perhaps we are not looking at separate, isolated wonders, but at the remnants of a widespread, interconnected cultural phenomenon. A vast, sophisticated civilization that existed for thousands of years. A civilization that built temples on the hills of Anatolia and reshaped the deserts of Arabia, and then, for reasons we do not understand, simply vanished from the historical record. The implications are staggering. It means that our history is not a gentle, upward curve of progress, but a series of dramatic peaks and valleys. There may have been great flowerings of human ingenuity and social organisation that rose, flourished, and then collapsed, leaving behind only the most durable of their creations. We are a species with a profound amnesia, and we are only now beginning to find the clues that hint at the memories we have lost. The story we tell ourselves about our past, the one that begins with small bands of hunters, then progresses to simple farmers, then to the first towns and cities, may be fundamentally wrong, or at least fundamentally incomplete. It forces us to ask what else is out there, hidden in plain sight. If thousands of structures, some of them miles long, can go unnoticed for most of human history in the deserts of the Middle East, what lies undiscovered in the Amazon rainforest beneath the canopy? What is buried under the shallow waters of our continental shelves, in areas that were dry land during the last ice age? The story of the works of the old men is a profound lesson in humility. It reminds us that the world is much older and stranger than we think, and that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. These low stone walls, these silent circles and wheels, are not just an archaeological puzzle. They are a message to us from a forgotten world. They tell us that our ancestors were not the simple, primitive people we imagine them to be. They were thinkers, planners, engineers, and artists. They had a deep understanding of their environment, a complex social order, and a powerful drive to leave their mark upon the world. They wrote their story not on paper or clay tablets, but on the surface of the planet itself, with a pen made of rock and a canvas of desert. When you look at a satellite image of Jordan now, you are not just seeing a desert. You are seeing a graveyard of ambition. You are seeing the ghost of a world that should not have existed. Each faint line, each perfect circle, is a question mark aimed directly at our core assumptions about human history. They challenge us to think bigger, to dig deeper, and to accept that the story of our species is far more complex and far more magnificent than we have ever dared to imagine. The old men are long gone, but their works endure, waiting for a generation with the eyes to see them and the courage to ask what they mean. Their silence speaks volumes, and what it tells us is that we are only at the very beginning of understanding who we really are. Let's zoom in on that idea, the understanding of an environment. The builders of the kites didn't just understand the landscape, they understood the minds of the animals that lived within it. The design of these traps is a masterclass in behavioural psychology. Gazelle are creatures of instinct, programmed with specific flight responses. The kite builders knew this. They leveraged it with a terrifying precision. Petiot, look at the walls again. They are intentionally kept low. Why? A panicked gazelle can leap a much higher barrier, but a low wall doesn't register as an insurmountable obstacle. It registers as a guideline, a path of least resistance. The herd feels channeled, not trapped. It's a subtle deception. The animals believe they're choosing their path, running along a natural feature, when in fact their every step is being dictated by an intelligence they cannot comprehend. And the openings. In some of the longest guiding walls, archaeologists have found small, periodic gaps. From a distance, these must have looked like escape routes to the desperate animals, a chance to break free. But they were decoys. These gaps often led to smaller hidden enclosures, dead ends, or into even more treacherous terrain. It's a level of cunning that is almost cruel. It's the logic of a chess master playing against an opponent who can't even see the board. This wasn't just brute force, it was a cognitive weapon. It implies a deep, patient observation of animal behaviour, a knowledge passed down through generations. These people knew the migration routes, the seasonal patterns, the very anxieties of their prey. They knew that a straight line might spook the herd, so they built the walls with gentle, almost imperceptible curves that followed the natural contours of the land. They were, in a very real sense, programming the herd's behaviour, using stone and landscape as their code. Now consider the final moments of the hunt. At the narrowest point of the kite, the head, the design becomes even more ingenious. The converging walls don't just end in a single pit. Often they lead into a chamber from which multiple pits radiate outwards. The lead animals would fall into the first pit, creating a pile of bodies. The animals behind, in a state of sheer panic, would swerve to avoid their fallen comrades, only to be funneled directly into the next pit and the next. It was a killing machine of unparalleled efficiency. The sheer volume of bones found in the few excavated pits tells a chilling story. We're not talking about a dozen animals, we're talking about hundreds in a single event. Pits filled to the brim with the remains of gazelle, onager, oryx and other hoofed animals. In one excavated site in Syria, the bone deposits were so dense they indicated repeated, massive slaughters over a long period. This wasn't a hunt for dinner. This was an abattoir. This was industrial-scale harvesting that would have produced a staggering surplus. What do you do with 10,000 pounds of meat in a world without refrigeration? Some of it could be dried, salted, or smoked, creating a durable food source that could last for months. This completely changes the dynamic of a hunter-gatherer society. It eliminates the daily precarious search for food. It provides security. It creates wealth. And with wealth comes power. Imagine the society that controlled these kites. They would have held the key to survival for the entire region. They wouldn't just be a band of hunters. They would be resource barons of the Neolithic age. They could support a much larger population. They could fund a specialised class of people who did not hunt, craftsmen, priests, builders, and perhaps even soldiers to defend their incredibly valuable infrastructure. Suddenly the labour force required to build these structures doesn't seem so impossible. It was funded by the very system it created. It was a self-perpetuating engine of complexity. But here's where the story takes another turn, because the kites, circles and wheels are not the only structures these people left behind. As we scan the satellite imagery, other, even more cryptic shapes emerge from the desert floor. Let's talk about the gates. Archaeologists have identified hundreds of these formations, often in the same volcanic fields as the kite is. They look nothing like the other structures. A gate consists of two short, thick stone piles, or cairns, connected by two or more long, perfectly parallel stone walls. The entire structure can be hundreds of metres long. They look, for all the world, like a schematic for a giant capacitor, or some piece of modern art laid out on the sand. Their purpose is a complete and total mystery. They are not traps. There's no way to funnel animals into them. They are not defensive. The walls are too low and the structure is completely open at both ends. They are not dwellings. They have no roofs, no hearths, no signs of habitation. Like the big circles, they're often swept clean of any artefacts that might give us a clue. They are just there, hundreds of them, silent, geometric statements. What possible function could they have served? Were they ceremonial pathways? Did processions of people move between the parallel walls during some forgotten ritual? Or were they markers of territory, symbolic boundaries between different clans or tribes? Some researchers have noted that gates are often found on the slopes of hills and seem to avoid the valleys where kites are typically built. This suggests a separation of function, a landscape divided into zones, the sacred and the profane, the ritualistic and the practical. One of the oldest of these gates, found in Saudi Arabia, was built on the slope of a volcano. Its two parallel walls are 600 meters long. Imagine the effort. Imagine the coordination. All for a purpose we cannot even begin to guess. It's like finding a single cryptic line of code in a program written in a long-dead language. We can see the structure, we can admire its precision, but we have no idea what it was designed to do. It's pure abstract form. And then there are the pendants. These are different again. A pendant is typically a main burial cairn, a tomb, from which a long single line of smaller cairns trails away, sometimes for hundreds of meters. They look like a kite's tail tied to a grave, or perhaps a comet, with the tomb as the nucleus and the smaller stones as the trailing debris field. They are explicitly funerary. They are monuments to the dead, connecting a single point of burial to a long line across the landscape. What does the line represent? A journey to the afterlife? The lineage of the person buried within? Again, we are forced into speculation. But the visual message is powerful. The dead are not just in one place. Their presence is extended, drawn out, written into the topography of the land itself. It's a way of saying that the ancestors are not gone. They are woven into the very fabric of the world. So now we have a far more complex picture. We have an ancient landscape that is not just a hunting ground. It is also a ritual space, a burial ground, and a canvas for vast geometric art. Kites for the animals, wheels and circles for ceremony or the heavens, pendants for the dead, gates for a purpose we may never know. This was a world teeming with meaning, a place where every feature of the landscape was imbued with human intention. And the arrangement is not random. The structures relate to each other. In some areas, ancient pathways cleared of the darkest desert stones can be seen connecting different clusters of structures. These are not roads for wagons. They are footpaths for people, worn into the desert pavement over centuries or millennia. You can trace them from a cluster of wheels to a series of gates, and then on towards a massive kite complex in a valley below. What you're looking at is the blueprint of a connected society, a society on the move, but not as random nomads. Their movements were purposeful, likely seasonal between these great stone anchors. They would gather at the circles for social or religious events, they would honour their dead at the pendants, and they would converge on the kites for the great communal hunts that funded their entire way of life. This was not a primitive existence. This was a highly organised, ritualised, and deeply meaningful culture, spread over a vast geographical area. Let's re-examine the wheels from this new perspective. If this was a society so deeply concerned with ritual, symbolism, and connection to the landscape, maybe the astronomical explanation is only part of the story. What if the wheels are not just calendars, but cosmological maps? What if the central cairn represents the centre of the world, or the point of creation? What if the spokes represent the pathways to different worlds in a shamanic cosmology, or the connections between the world of the living, the sky world above, and the underworld below? In many ancient cultures, the circle is the most powerful symbol of all. It represents totality, eternity, the sun, the cycle of life and death. By building hundreds of these giant circles and wheels, were these people physically manifesting their worldview? Were they attempting to create a resonance between the earth and the heavens, to make the land below a mirror of the cosmos above? It's an idea that is impossible to prove, but it fits the sheer scale and strangeness of their creations far better than any simple, utilitarian explanation. They weren't just living on the land, they were in a constant, dynamic dialogue with it. This level of abstract thought, this capacity for massive, multi-generational projects, represents a profound cognitive shift in human history. To design a kite, you need to be able to hold a complex three-dimensional map of miles of terrain in your mind. You need to be able to visualize it from above, a perspective you do not physically have. You need to be able to think in terms of cause and effect over long distances and time scales. This is systems thinking. It's the same kind of intelligence needed to design a city's water supply or a computer network. Where did this intelligence come from? The standard model suggests that this kind of cognitive toolkit develops slowly as a result of the pressures of agriculture and urban living. But here, it exists thousands of years before that. It suggests the human brain was already fully equipped for modern, abstract thought at a much earlier stage. The hardware was there. All it needed was the right cultural software and the right environmental opportunity to be activated. The environment of the early Holocene, that greener, wetter period after the last ice age, may have been that opportunity. For a few thousand years, this region was a paradise. The stability and abundance of resources gave these people something that most hunter-gatherers never have: time. Time to think, time to experiment, time to plan and build things that weren't for immediate survival. They had the luxury of looking beyond the next meal and contemplating their place in the universe, and then expressing those contemplations in stone. But what if there was another driver? What if this explosion of creativity and engineering wasn't born of stability, but of fear? The period we're talking about, from 10,000 BC to 6,000 BC, followed one of the most traumatic climate events in recent geological history, the Younger Dryas. A sudden brutal return to Ice Age conditions that lasted for over 1,000 years. The people who lived through that, or their immediate descendants, would have carried the memory of a world where the sky could fall, where the climate could turn on you in a single generation. Could these monumental structures be a response to that trauma, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic world? When your environment is unpredictable, you seek to control it. The kites are the ultimate expression of control over the animal world. The circles and wheels, with their perfect geometry, are an imposition of human order onto the wildness of nature. Perhaps these were not monuments of confidence, but monuments of anxiety, a grand collective effort to build a stable, predictable world in stone because they knew the natural world could no longer be trusted. This psychological interpretation adds another layer of depth to the mystery. We are not just looking at the works of ancient engineers, but at the archaeology of a state of mind. We are seeing the fossilized remains of a culture grappling with some of the same existential questions we face today. How do we secure our future? How do we create order out of chaos? How do we find meaning in a world that is so much larger and more powerful than we are? And the builders themselves remain ghosts in their own machine. Genetic studies from the wider Levant region during this period paint a picture of a complex mix of populations. There isn't one single unified genetic group. It was a melting pot. It's likely that the people who built the wheels were not necessarily the same people who later built the most advanced kites. We are looking at a cultural tradition that was passed on, adopted, and adapted by different groups over thousands of years. It was an idea, a set of technologies and beliefs that was more durable than any single tribe or people. This makes the continuity of the building projects even more remarkable. For these structures to be maintained and expanded over millennia, there must have been a powerful system for transmitting knowledge. This couldn't have been done through simple word of mouth. It suggests the existence of guilds or schools of thought, or perhaps a priestly class that held the sacred knowledge of geometry, astronomy, and landscape engineering. a class of intellectuals, of scientists and architects in an age before writing. Their textbooks were the stones themselves, their classrooms, the open desert. This is a direct challenge to our definition of civilization. We tend to associate it with writing, metallurgy, and centralized government in cities. But what if there are other forms? What if this was a lithic civilization, a civilization of stone? Its great achievements were not pyramids or palaces, but a subtle and profound integration with the natural landscape. It did not seek to dominate nature by building walls to keep it out, but to choreograph it, to work with its flows and tendencies on a continental scale. It's a completely different model, and one we have almost entirely overlooked because we have been looking for the wrong clues. We search for the ruins of cities, but what if their city was the entire landscape? We search for the tombs of kings, but what if their power structures were more diffuse, based on clan leadership and shared ritual knowledge? We search for libraries of texts, but what if their great library was the desert itself, its pages written in lines of stone that encoded thousands of years of ecological and cosmological knowledge? This idea is not as radical as it sounds. Consider the songlines of the indigenous Australians. These are invisible pathways that crisscross the entire continent, connecting sacred sites and encoding vast amounts of knowledge about navigation, resource locations, and mythology. A songline is a map, a history book, and a religious text all in one, passed down orally through generations. The works of the old men could be a physical manifestation of the same kind of deep landscape-based knowledge system. They made their songlines permanent, and this phenomenon may not be confined to the Middle East. Let's fly across the globe to the Atacama Desert in South America, one of the driest places on Earth. Etched into its hillsides are over 5,000 geoglyphs. The most famous is the Atacama Giant, a huge anthropomorphic figure, but there are also geometric shapes, animals, and strange abstract symbols. Many of these are thousands of years old. Like the works in Jordan, they're best viewed from the sky and were made by removing the dark surface stones to reveal the lighter soil beneath. The Nazca lines in Peru are even more famous, with their stunning hummingbirds and spiders visible only from the air. While most of these are dated to a later period, they are part of the same human impulse. Why did ancient people, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, all feel the need to create massive art that they themselves could never fully appreciate from the ground? What were they trying to say, and who were they trying to say it to? These global parallels suggest we are not looking at a local anomaly in Jordan. We are tapping into a deep, archetypal behaviour of the human species. A behaviour that emerges when a society reaches a certain level of complexity and begins to ask bigger questions about its place in the cosmos. The drive to mark the land, to impose a human pattern upon it, to communicate with forces larger than oneself, whether they be gods, spirits, or the sky itself, seems to be a universal part of our journey. What is unique about the Jordanian case is its sheer staggering age. It places this cognitive and cultural leap right at the dawn of our modern world. In the immediate aftermath of the last ice age, it suggests that the first great project of humanity, after surviving the deep freeze, was not just to farm, but to think, to organise, to build on a scale that was utterly audacious. Let's go back to the labour force for a moment. How do you motivate thousands of people to quarry, haul and place millions of stones for a project that might not be completed in their lifetime? You can't do it through force alone. That requires a huge apparatus of control, of soldiers and overseers, for which we have no evidence. You have to do it through shared belief. The people who built these structures must have believed in their purpose, with a fervour that is hard for us to comprehend. Whether it was a religious duty, a social obligation, or a deep-seated belief that their survival depended on these great works, they were united in a common cause. This is the hallmark of a powerful ideology. It's the same kind of force that built the great cathedrals of Europe, with generations of stonemasons laying stones on a structure they would never see finished, all for the glory of God. What was the God or the great idea that drove the people of the Black Desert? The silence from them is absolute. It is the vastness of that silence that is so unsettling. We have their works, but we do not have their words. We do not have their stories, their myths, their justifications. We are left with only the result of their ideology, not the ideology itself. And so we are forced to project our own ideas onto them. They were astronomers, they were shamans, they were master hunters, they were the first kings. They may have been all of these things, or none of them. This forces us to confront the limits of our own knowledge, the fragility of the historical record. Everything we think we know about the past is based on the tiny fraction of material that has survived, and for the most part, that means durable objects from large settled populations. The story of humanity is written by its urbanites. But what if, for thousands of years, the most dynamic, innovative, and powerful cultures were not urban? What if they were based in the landscape itself, and left behind a record that we have only just learned how to read from 30,000 feet in the air? The discovery of these structures, driven by satellite imagery and new dating techniques, is as revolutionary as the discovery of a new continent. It is a continent in time. It opens up a vast unexplored territory in the human story. And we have only just begun to survey its coastline. Every new image, every new excavation reveals more complexity, more mystery. For instance, recent surveys have revealed that many of the kites show evidence of remodeling and expansion over time. Older, simpler designs were added to, their arms extended, new pits dug. This is not the work of a single, static culture. It's the work of a living, evolving tradition. They were constantly refining their technology, improving their methods, scaling up their operations. This is a culture of innovation. They were scientists of the hunt, and their knowledge may not have died out completely. Is it possible that the deep understanding of the desert landscape, the ability to read the signs and patterns of animal life, was passed down and became part of the cultural DNA of the later peoples who inhabited this region? Like the Bedouin, the technologies were forgotten, the great structures fell into ruin and became invisible, but perhaps a shadow of that ancient wisdom survived. We must also ask a darker question. What was the ecological impact of this industrial-scale hunting? When you remove hundreds of thousands of animals from an ecosystem over centuries, you are no longer just a participant in it. You are the dominant force of change. Did the builders of the kites hunt the great herds of gazelle to extinction, or to the brink of it? Perhaps their system was too successful for its own good. They created an engine that could produce a massive surplus, which in turn fueled population growth and social complexity. But the engine required a constant supply of fuel, the animal herds. If that fuel source began to dwindle, and at the same time the climate began to dry out, turning the savannah into desert, their entire world would have collapsed. Their greatest strength, this hyper-efficient hunting system, would have become their fatal weakness. If this is true, then the ruins of the kites are not just a mystery, They are a warning. They are a monument to a society that may have engineered its own demise by exploiting its primary resource beyond the point of recovery. It's a story that feels uncomfortably modern. It suggests that the cycle of innovation, over-exploitation, and collapse is not just a feature of our industrial age, but may be a recurring pattern in human history. When you see these structures from the air, you are seeing the fossil of a great experiment, an experiment in social organisation, in landscape engineering, in resource management. It flourished for thousands of years. It produced wonders of a scale and precision that still baffle us today. And then it ended. The people vanished, the climate changed, and the desert reclaimed their works, preserving them under a blanket of silence and sand, waiting for a future civilization with the eyes in the sky to find them again. The story is far from over. Each year more structures are identified. LiDAR technology, which can see through vegetation and map the ground in 3 dimensions, is now being deployed in the more vegetated areas on the fringe of the desert, and it is revealing even more. We are in the middle of a revolution in our understanding of this period. We are the first generation to see this lost world in its full, staggering scope. It requires a fundamental recalibration of our sense of the past. The timeline is longer, the capabilities of our ancestors greater, and their societies more complex than we ever imagined. The tidy, linear progression from hunter to farmer to city dweller is a fiction, a simplified narrative we told ourselves because it was easy to understand. The reality is much messier, much more interesting, and filled with these spectacular chapters that we are only now rediscovering. Every one of these stone lines is a thread, and if we can pull on it, it might just unravel a whole section of the tapestry of human history that we thought was complete. The ghost architects of the desert are silent, but their creations speak. They speak of a time when the human mind awoke to its own power, its ability to see beyond the horizon, to plan across generations, and to reshape the world in the image of its own imagination. They challenge our condescension towards the past, and they remind us that beneath the surface of the world we know, there are other, older worlds hidden in plain sight, waiting for their stories to be told. Let's put ourselves on the ground 10,000 years ago, stand in the middle of one of these volcanic fields, the Harat al-Shafa. The ground is a sea of black and grey basalt rock, sharp and unforgiving. It crunches under your feet. This is not an easy place to work. It is hot, exposed, and the stones themselves are heavy and abrasive. So the first question we have to ask is, why here? Why choose this incredibly difficult environment for their grand project? The answer, it seems, is that the landscape was not an obstacle to be overcome. It was the medium itself. These volcanic fields provided the perfect materials for their purpose. The dark basalt stones, when cleared, revealed the lighter yellowish soil beneath. This contrast creates a stark visual line, a drawing that is visible from a great distance and, of course, from the sky. They were not just building walls, they were drawing on the earth. The geology of the region was their canvas and their ink. This choice reveals a deep intimacy with their environment. They understood its properties not just for survival, but for art, for engineering, for expression. They saw the potential in the land that no one else had seen. They realized that by simply moving rocks from one place to another, they could create patterns of immense size and permanence. It was a technological and artistic breakthrough, as profound in its own way as the first cave painting or the first clay pot. It also tells us something about their aesthetic. They were creating a high contrast world. In a landscape that can often appear as a monotonous beige or brown, They introduced sharp black lines of basalt. They imposed a graphic, almost digital, clarity onto the analog chaos of the desert. It's an act of separation, of definition, of bringing a human-conceived order to the natural world. They were terraformers, and their primary tool was the simple act of clearing a path. This brings us to the staggering question of technique. It is one thing to have a grand vision of a 400-metre perfect circle, but it is another thing entirely to execute it on the ground. How, without modern surveying equipment, without GPS, without even a written language to record measurements, did they achieve such precision? The answer lies in a form of applied mathematics and geometry that is breathtaking in its simplicity and effectiveness. To create a big circle, you need only three things: a stake, a long rope, and a dedicated team. You would drive the stake into the ground at the centre of your proposed circle. You would then attach a rope, perhaps woven from plant fibres or animal sinew, that was 200 metres long. Then, with one person holding the rope taut, the team would walk in a giant arc, placing stones along the path scribed by the end of the rope. It is, in essence, a giant compass. But think about the practical challenges. The ground is not flat, it has dips and rises. The rope would snag on rocks, it would stretch or shrink with humidity. To maintain a perfect circle over such a distance, with these primitive tools, would require constant correction, immense patience, and an almost fanatical dedication to the geometric ideal. The finished product wasn't just a wall, it was a testament to their ability to overcome entropy, to force a perfect, abstract shape onto an imperfect, real-world surface. The straight lines of the kites are an even greater puzzle. How do you keep a wall perfectly straight for over a kilometre? One method is to use ranging poles. You would have 3 people, each with a tall staff. The leader would stand at the start point, and the third person would walk to the desired end point. The person in the middle would then move back and forth until the leader could see all 3 staffs perfectly aligned, blocking each other from view. You place a stone at that spot and you repeat the process again and again for a kilometre. It's a slow, painstaking process that requires clear lines of sight and relentless precision. This is not the work of a disorganised mob. This is the work of trained specialists. It implies they had a class of people, surveyors, engineers, geometers, who understood these principles and could direct the labour of others. It means they had a system of measurement. We don't know what their units were. Was it a cubit, a pace, the length of a particular spear? But they must have had one to create such consistency. They were practicing a form of mathematics that was not written in symbols, but was embodied in action, in the physical process of construction itself. The structures are their equations, made manifest in stone, and we must remember that what we see today is only a skeleton. The low stone walls of the Kites were almost certainly not the full extent of the trap. Think about it. A panicked gazelle, even a small one, could easily leap over a metre-high wall of loose stones. To be truly effective, the walls would need to be higher, or appear higher. It is highly probable that the stone walls were just the foundation for a superstructure that has long since vanished. Imagine wooden stakes driven into the ground alongside the walls, with animal hides or woven screens stretched between them. This would create a visual barrier that was much more intimidating to the herd. It would flap in the wind, creating noise and movement, adding to the animals' terror and confusion. The kite would have been a multimedia installation of fear. This also helps explain the small gaps sometimes found in the walls. They might not have been decoys but locations for human hunters to hide. As the herd was driven down the funnel, hunters concealed behind these screens could emerge, shouting, waving hides and throwing spears to ensure the panicked animals stayed on course and did not try to double back. The kite was not a passive trap. It was a stage, and the hunt was a terrifying piece of theatre, with a cast of dozens, if not hundreds of people. The killing pits at the end were also likely more complex than the simple holes we see today. Some may have been lined with sharpened stakes. Others may have had wooden ramps leading in, designed to collapse under the weight of the animals, making it impossible for them to escape. We are only seeing the stone components, the most durable parts of a sophisticated, multi-material technology. The full ingenuity of these structures is lost to us because wood, hide and rope do not survive for 10,000 years in the desert. We are looking at the ruins of a machine with all its most crucial moving parts having rotted away to dust. This idea of a hidden organic layer applies to the other structures as well. Were the big circles just empty stone rings? Or were they the footing for a colossal tent-like structure, a sacred space for gatherings, sheltered from the sun and wind? Were the spokes of the wheels lined with decorated poles, flying banners of feathers or hide that marked the different clans? Our vision of this world is stark and lithic, but it was likely once a much more colourful, dynamic and noisy place. Now let's add another layer of evidence, one that gives us a rare and precious window into the minds of these builders: the rock art. In many of the same areas where we find the kites and wheels, the smooth black faces of the basalt rocks are covered in petroglyphs, images pecked into the dark desert varnish to reveal the lighter rock beneath, and what they depict is their world. There are countless scenes of animals: gazelle, oryx, ibex, lions and ostriches. But there are also hunting scenes. And crucially, some of these petroglyphs appear to be diagrams or maps of the kites themselves. We see the long guiding walls, the V-shape, and the enclosure at the end, with animals trapped inside. This is a staggering discovery. It is a blueprint, a schematic, drawn by the architects themselves. It shows that they were fully conscious of the overall shape and function of their creations. It is the closest thing we have to their written testimony. These images were not just decorative, they were likely functional and deeply magical. Perhaps they were used to teach younger generations how to conduct the hunts. A shaman or hunt leader might have stood before the rock face, tracing the lines with his finger, explaining the strategy, assigning roles to the hunters. The rock art was their whiteboard, their tactical map, but it was almost certainly more than that. In many cultures, to draw the image of an animal is to gain power over it. To depict a successful hunt is a form of sympathetic magic, a way of ensuring that the real hunt will also be successful. The act of carving the image was a ritual in itself, a way of focusing the collective will of the group on the desired outcome. The petroglyphs, then, are not just pictures of hunts, they are prayers in stone. They are incantations designed to make the world conform to their wishes. This gives us a profound insight into their worldview. They saw the spiritual and the practical as being completely intertwined. To build a kite was an act of engineering. To decorate it with magical images was an essential part of that same engineering process. You could not have one without the other. The success of the hunt depended as much on the proper rituals and the correct state of mind as it did on the angle of the walls or the depth of the pits. Some of the rock art is even stranger. We find human figures with strange, elongated bodies, wearing headdresses or masks. Are these gods, spirits, or shamans in the middle of a trance? We see complex geometric patterns that match no known object, grids, lattices, and complex swirling lines. Are these maps of the spirit world, diagrams of their cosmology? We simply do not know. but they tell us that their intellectual and spiritual life was every bit as complex and sophisticated as their engineering. Consider the implications of this. We have a society that possessed a practical, almost scientific understanding of geometry, animal behaviour, and large-scale project management. At the same time, they lived in an enchanted world, a world of spirits and magical forces, a world where drawing a picture could influence reality. These two modes of thought, which we see as separate, the rational and the magical, were for them two sides of the same coin. This fusion of worldviews may have been the very engine of their success. Their belief gave them the motivation, and their practical skills gave them the means to turn that belief into reality on a staggering scale. And they left other clues, other structures that defy any easy explanation. Across the deserts of Arabia, archaeologists have found what they call meandering walls. These are low stone walls, just like the ones used in kites, but they don't form any recognizable shape. They simply snake across the landscape for kilometers, seemingly at random. They don't enclose anything. They don't lead anywhere. They are pure abstract lines drawn across the earth. What conceivable purpose could they have served? Were they territorial markers, the ancient equivalent of a fence, even though they are so low they could be stepped over? Were they processional ways guiding people on long ritual pilgrimages across the landscape? Or was the act of building them the purpose itself? Perhaps these meandering walls, stretching across the ancient earth, were not meant to serve any practical purpose we can immediately grasp. What if their true significance lies in the very act of their creation, a vast abstract canvas drawn by a people who saw the world through a fused lens of practicality and profound spiritual meaning? These structures, like the intricate rock art and the enigmatic kites, force us to confront the limits of our own modern, often hyper-rational understanding. They remind us that for much of human history, the pursuit of knowledge, the mapping of territory, and the shaping of the world were deeply intertwined with ritual, belief, and an awe-inspiring connection to the unseen. They challenge us to ask, have we lost something vital in separating these two powerful modes of perceiving reality? What forgotten wisdom might still be hidden in these silent stone lines, waiting for us to reconnect the rational with the magical? Drop a comment below and tell us what you think these baffling patterns might reveal.